Jacobo Grinberg, The Vehicle of Transformations, 1976. A Pepe Newman as a memory of a conversation. I thank Conocete and its director, Mr. Gerardo Bueno, the help and encouragement they have given me, and that made the realization possible of this work. Vehicle of Transformations in a Tabernacle. In the Jewish tradition, the tabernacle was the sacred place where the books were kept. Surely, at the beginning of the tradition, privilege was related to the ability to be. Afterwards, when the traditional rule was institutionalized, it became family heritage, thereby losing all its real and profound meaning and symbolism. The same thing happened that Kafka imagined when he wrote The Wall China, originally built for defense and protection, but later, with the passing of generations, built only by Build It. The present vehicle of transformations does not relate the Jewish history, is only intended to be a safeguard of the sacred. It is only a journey to the internal universe. Reminiscence is verbal of its content and transformations. I call it the vehicle of transformation, so to speak, form, and because the phrase represents in part the meaning of a search for the essence. In writing it, I have had to omit many experiences, not because I consider them false or dangerous, but because of my limited ability to transform them into words. Includes, in a series of stories and commentaries, the certainty that we are a vehicle that transforms content, thus creating realities that surpass the imaginable. New York, September 1974. First part. Stories. The Fly. A blue fly was flying in the room. It was approaching the window and, believing it to be glassless, crashed into it. Thousands of times he crashed, and after each one, he fell unconscious to the floor. Little by little he realized that there was something very mysterious that prevented him from reaching the outside. The fly bluish began to look for a hole in the room. One day he was flying near the roof and landed on the lamp, and as he moved it, he felt a hole. Very carefully he put his head in. A cool, damp breeze hit his compound eyes. He thought for a few minutes whether he would dare to penetrate, and, deciding to do it, he bent his body and passed the wings to the other side. The hole widened with each step. At the bottom I could just make out a faint little light that was flickering. The possibility of being free from the window and the walls of the room strengthened his impulses. He flapped his wings and prepared to approach the light. He could not fly because there was a lot of danger of colliding with some unexpected projection, so he chose to walk. For hours he advanced millimeter by millimeter, until, completely exhausted, she lay down sleep. The next morning I was close to the light, which passed through a hole the size of a pin. Its wings lit up, and his eyes shone in hundreds of facets. He looked around, and, not finding any tools, began to scratch the edges of the hole using his paws front and the mouth. It had almost no strength, but the perspective when she left, she was so striking and beautiful that she continued working. After 3 days, the hole was already large enough to allow him to pass. But anticipating some unfortunate brush, he first licked his wings and the body, and then went through the wall. The spectacle he saw on the other side was wonderful, a great bright room and a garden full of air and light. Heading towards the garden, he bumped into something transparent. Thousands of times he crashed, and after each one, he fell unconscious on the ground. Little by little he realized that there was something very mysterious that prevented him from reaching the outside. The blue fly began to look for a hole in the room. The dream, The Pan-Islamic Conference was held in the Palace of Government of Kuwait. The building was considered a marvel architectural for its originality and unlimited use of bold combinations of glass, marble, and aluminum. The gigantic auditorium had capacity for 5,000 people, and his podium was suspended in the air by the action of two gigantic magnets that balanced their fields. The idea had belonged to King Hassan and was intended to create the mystical impression of supernatural power. It was an immemorial custom to read, at the beginning of every session, the delegates' morning diary began to take their places. It had dawned an hour earlier, and the morning was bright and fresh. At 8 o'clock opened the session, and the president in turn went up to the podium, and he made the usual introduction that always preceded the reading the diary. Dear brothers and sisters, in our morning session today, we will talk about the world's financial problems Arabic, a subject that due to its material nature disgusts and bothers to most of us. That is why, as an antidote, I have chosen as initial reading the description that the Prophet Balu Abba makes one of his dreams. Listen with attention, and may Allah enlighten your understanding. I went to bed when the moon reached its zenith. I asked my God give me enough strength to continue my work, and these are the visions that appeared during my journey nocturnal. I was walking in the desert, in the middle of a Jamsin. The heat and the sand had blinded me, and I groped for a place to take shelter. Suddenly a large pond surrounded by reeds and tropical vegetation. In the water there were two pairs of chess players. Boards floated covered by a thin layer of liquid transparent, and the wet pieces moved heavily in them. I decided I would play too. I went into the pond until the water covered my whole body, and I placed a board in front of me. It submerged, taking with it all the pieces of my game. At that moment, I left the desert and found myself in the interior of a large castle. When I realized that the castle was inside, I set out to observe myself. I saw a house full of eyes that danced fantastic dances. Those on the right they moved in all directions, adopting the strangest and aberrant postures. After a few moments, the eyes appeared on my forehead and cheeks. I had no doubt lagoon that I was watching myself, but at the same time I was terrified of having so many eyes. When I looked more closely, I noticed that my image was the reflection of a mirror that calmed me down. At that moment, I woke up feeling that something I once possessed had been let go of myself. When I touched my face, I realized that everything had been a dream. Reading the Prophet's diary always had the same effect on the delegates. Absolute silence reigned in the great auditorium until the president, playing a small bell, the finance session began. The composer. Unfortunately, sleep was still necessary. Of course, life was different after the operation, more exciting, always new, and above all more creative. Maybe I should say, lives were different. The announcement had not surprised Julio. It simply had confirmed what he had suspected for 3 months. Of course the prospect was terrifying, but Julio had the rare quality of blocking out any thought depressed. So he locked himself in a room and for a week tried to decide what he would do in the 6 months that remained alive. The first thing that occurred to him was to continue living off the same way as always. However, he abandoned the idea for find it too boring. Then he thought about dedicating himself to read all the books I had always wanted to. The idea was good, but the procedure is slow and tedious. He considered the possibility of traveling and getting to know countries and people. The prospect appealed to him, but Julio didn't have the means. Sufficient financial resources to carry it out. Finally decided, packed his things and headed to Bethesda after making an appointment with Dr. Dave. The operating room was impressive. Julio had his head shaved. And after accommodating it under a huge and complicated stainless steel ring, one was implanted in 100 pairs of thin platinum electrodes. As usual, Julio got up at 6 in the morning. Through the studio windows, a breeze filtered orange and silver light illuminating the piano. July decided that he would dedicate the morning session to touring deserts. He recalled that such experiences resulted from a combination of the smell of sand, heat, and light. Julio sat on the stool and pressed the 14th key. Suddenly the wall started to burn, the glass from the window to melt, and the flowers on the piano to move as if a very strong wind had taken hold of their colors. Julio sweated and felt like he had a gigantic force on his arms and fingers. He pressed that key again, then the 15th, paused and continued with a series of arabesques and changes of rhythm until, after an explosion of movements in continuous crescendo, lowered the arms and stared at one of the keys. He tried to remember step by step what had happened to him during the composition. As always, he faced the difficulty almost insurmountable from reproducing thousands of images and thoughts. The only thing he remembered was that after feeling the brightness of the wall, the window and the flowers, its own body had become a torch. His fingers had burst into firework lights, and his chest had expanded into a balloon multicolored with very thin walls. The warmth and light within had taken shape, and the vision of the sun had appeared reflecting on the sand of the dunes. Everything had become infinite space and sun burning. Even the rocks of the fission reflected the light, as if its edges would have been polished like a mirror. The sensations had been exact but not pleasant. In the past, similar feelings would have driven him to give up. But then he understood that giving up an experience simply because you consider it unpleasant meant a complete lack of vision and maturity. Julio pressed the 22nd key and then the 25th. It occurred to him that it would be interesting to create association between proprioceptive and olfactory sensations. The position of his arm and fingers became a smell of peach mixed with the aroma of aged wine. Her legs, they smelled like wood, and their tongues like pineapple. He got hungry, got up from his seat and went to the kitchen. While drinking a glass of milk, Julio thought about what wonderful that her life had become. I had felt that I possessed a stable and invariant self, but now he realized that it had only been an illusion. He had many jewels inside him, more than he had ever known. Imagined. Each of them felt differently, had infinitely varied experiences, although, I had to admit, the integrating center that was maintained never disappeared as a reference. He sat down at the piano. He had no idea how to achieve what he set out to do. The only thing he could think of was possibility of causing simultaneous activation of all the access points to your brain. Perhaps that would be enough. Right. Julio wasn't scared because he had already had one similar experience and knew that the painful sensation was going to disappear, so he let her continue. Suddenly a face appeared in front of him. At first he didn't recognize it, but then he realized that it was his, and that it was moving one end of the room to the other. The face began to move away and was replaced by the gigantic vision of an eye. Julio realized that it was his too. The eye grew in size until it becomes a pupillary opening the size of the home, the city, and the entire planet. Julio was introduced to the pupil, and in that instant it disappeared. The news appeared the next day in the section police report from the most vulgar of the city's newspapers. A middle-aged man was found dead. in front of his piano. The four of us. Hey! Music is starting to play inside. It is no longer the feeling of something that is received. But, hadn't you noticed? Look, it's not that I hadn't noticed, but I didn't hear her. I was always busy with other things. Although, wait, I didn't realize I was talking to you, and now that I think about it, I've always spoken to you without knowing it. It's hard to accept. You are so familiar to me that in sometimes you take my place. I stop feeling like myself need of the world and things become beautiful. It's like always live the most important thing. Hey, the intruder has arrived. He started looking at me saying this, and I feel like he wants to ask me if it's real or imagined. When you spoke to me just now, you told me no. I would fight against the cursed feeling, and I really thought about it, but I prefer to destroy it. Well, what things you are busy with. You forget that you just discovered that I always exist, and you were trying to understand if it was you or me. It's true, forgive me, but I want to destroy the distance to always be you. Look, fear comes to me every time more often, and when that happens I stop talking to you. But who are you? You talk to me and I listen and you say words. Wise, in fact, I always thought it was natural to talk to you, but now, for the others, I begin to feel that maybe I am different. Is it you or is it me? You always know everything and you comfort me, but I know you are inside me, and I speak to you as I would speak to a friend. Are you a friend at all, my brain? Or is it really me? Or are you coming to me? Because there are three voices in me, the one who sees, yours, and the voice of fear. But actually, I'm wrong. There is one more, the one who sees the other three. Which of the four am I? Why do I like it so much when you talk to me and I hate listening to the other three? You know, I saw that creature again. It scares me. Animal, but today I bought flowers and gave them to him. He is a man of bald and gigantic head, with tiny eyes and a large beard. Dark, dirty, sick. I see him on every corner. When I notice, when I don't notice, it's not there. That's one of the things that make me think there is an external world. That's always been your struggle. You've been through periods in which you do not accept the existence of anything outside of you, and others in which you accept them so much that you forget about yourself. Same. That was your mistake. You can accept it and move on living. You say beautiful and wise words, but I would like ask yourself, how do you manage to accept and continue living? You should know this because you consider it logical and natural. You're putting me in a difficult position. Let me think about it and I'll tell you. If you have to think about it, it means you're just a voice. In me, a fraud, but at the same time a wise man. Never I had asked, and now it is everyone who listens to this voice. But let's hear the answer. Speak! I don't know the answer. You disappoint me. The damn voice has arrived. What do you have to tell me? I want to help you. What bothers you about me? My stomach. Put it aside, it's just a hindrance. Don't tell me. You're a wise man too, you make me laugh. I can't leave my stomach, not yet. There are things that learn, and I like that. I won't make that decision now, so leave me alone. Well done, you're winning. Hey, thanks for talking to me. You're welcome, you idiot. Now that I've told the story, I'm going to continue with what has not happened. Listen, the music that rises, reaching the point where I am. But I also think it's because give it credit. It's an incredible thing to give credit. They find out things. I thought it was just a matter of keeping a state of giving credit abroad. But now I know that it is not enough. It is necessary to give it to the interior. It exists, without the need for resort to the non-existence of others to prove it. It's just there, without the need for others to know it, possess, From this point of view, I want to know who you are. I can't answer you yet. I understand. I wouldn't listen to you. That's it. You still have many more comparisons to make. Do, and you would only put me in one of them. Sometimes I follow you and I feel bad. The other one comes and it scares me. He tells me that I'm going to stay with him. That indicates that I am not you, because if I were, I would not hear you at the time of feeling the distress. Does that mean I'm the anguish? But my friend, what is this thing you call anguish? It's my stomach. I feel like it's twisting. It's vegetative. Leave it then. I'll tell you the same thing as the other one. Leave it. Throw it away. Put it away and stay talking to me. I can't. Without my body it will die, and when it dies, it will end with everything. You would simply disappear, and so would I. Of course that sometimes I doubt. I think that maybe there is something that only me occupies, and that he would not die. But that is impossible. He would have to die, since when the brain is killed, that is lost and not reappears, for the simple reason that there was a disappearance of the elements, and therefore the machinery is destroyed. That's why I tell you that all four of us would die. Now I begin to hear another voice. It is accompanied by mystery and desire to hide. It is a voice that knows, but that cannot be clearly perceived. The problem is that when you start to hear it, things happen around you. Strange noises are heard, things disappear, and everything begins to coincide. Moreover, smells from the past appear, and that is a total demonstration of his current presence. Damn fear, I should let go, but I can't. Now I'll start asking myself things that I remember, to search in my files for that which does not let me continue and tries to push me back. There is much evidence that something terrible happened. The search. It had rained all night, and in the early morning it smelled like river, wet earth and humid air. Pedro got up early. As always, the crickets were singing. They were a company pleasant, and Peter thanked them for their sound. The prospect of what would happen that night filled him of a strange joy. I almost had the impression that I would find what he was looking for. He decided to go back to bed. He took the pillow, smelled it, and hugged it. It was the most pleasant at night, thinking half awake about what I had dreamed, and closed my eyes and saw them full of images, magic. At 9 in the morning he woke up again. He felt overwhelmed by all the work that lay ahead, but at the same time, happy about what would come next. Completely decided, he got out of bed, smelled it for the last time and postponed taking a shower. No matter what he did, he always talked and disagreed with his voice. Now, as the water ran over his body, he tried to imagine the sensation and to know where it came from. Suddenly he realized that he was thinking, and scolded himself for it. At 9 o'clock at night, Henri came to look for him. He argued with him about his latest experiences, and when they got tired of talking and arrived home. The apartment was filled with the sound of water running, and all of Henri's belongings were scattered in the floor. Pedro pulled up a rocking chair and sat down. Henri put a disco. It was electronic music that followed the rhythm of changes in the Earth's magnetic field. An astrophysicist had registered for a whole year, and then had them concentrated in 10 minutes of recording. Pedro felt transported to another world. I was impressed by the beauty of what I perceived. It seemed like a variation on a theme by Bach or Scarlatti. The sensation was similar to relaxation. The body felt calm and completely full of light. Peter began to understand. Perhaps what I was hearing was autumn, and the imminent future of universal cold. The idea was in agreement with what I knew about that music. Possibly the atmospheric and vegetation changes caused alterations in the magnetic field, and therefore this represented the other. But there was another possibility. Perhaps the man himself was capable of causing disturbances in the field, and therefore the music could be representing the average to the sum of the mental state of all the inhabitants of the planet. Pedro didn't dare raise this possibility with Henri. I knew he had earned a PhD in physics from Individuals Elementary, and perhaps would mock, however, the possibility she was so attractive that he asked her almost in a whisper if she was possible to alter a gigantic magnetic field with another very little. Henri replied that it was impossible. Pedro insisted, "Imagine that from the outside you were to record the field magnetic produced by a large electromagnet, and that during the search, if you brought a man into the field, he would alter the latter." Henri thought for a moment. After scratching his mustache, he told Pedro that he had once been inside a field produced by one of the electromagnets of the cyclotron he was working with on a research project. I hadn't felt any change at all. But, Peter asked again, was there any change in the field of the electromagnet when you entered he? I don't know, Henri replied. I didn't measure it, however. I can tell you that on one occasion I tried to measure at a distance the magnetic field produced by a human brain, and the results were so slight that I dare not say anything. Pedro thought that Henri had not understood him. He knew that it was the result of us daring to pose it in the form straight to what I was thinking. Henri continued, "Do you know that there is a recorder of human fields?" "No, I don't know," replied Pedro. "Well, yes, it is a series of super-sensitive low-frequency amplifiers impedance that are placed very close to the head and record the field changes in a similar way as a electrode records electroencephalographic activity." Pedro asked Henri to let him listen to the music. It had changed. It was no longer calm and sweet, what he said, but something very different. The notes were higher, and the rhythm more accelerated. Peter thought that autumn had passed and that now it was winter. He made this known to Henri. He stood up from his seat and went to look for another disc. After several minutes, he returned with a Mass by Vivaldi. Pedro was excited by the prospect of hearing her. He settled down in his seat and prepared to listen. The music began to move him, invade. I felt that communication had been established direct between the composer and him, the creator of that music. He talked about his mystical experiences, and the language that used was so clear and powerful that Peter became a mystic. He felt an incredibly sensual pleasure and did not dare to make any move to avoid ending this sensation. Henri left the room, and when Pedro felt alone, he dared to try something he had always avoided. He closed his eyes and let himself be transported by his state. He felt like he was entering a large whirlpool that expanded more and more. Suddenly, he saw a staircase and felt himself climbing the stairs. Steps, first slowly and then at high speed. The staircase disappeared beneath his feet, and Pedro felt that an enormous force was pushing him upwards. When he reached at a certain height, the whirlpool expanded again. It was almost like sitting in a centrifuge. The speed of the spins increased, and the feeling of expansion was very clear. Pedro tried to figure out where he was going, and he began to talk to her. He told her that she could decide if she continued, would come to separate from his body, but then he would see it from above, and the vision would always accompany him. Peter. He began to get scared. He felt that seeing his body from up could be a terrifying experience. Perhaps your body would die, and he would see him like that, dead. Or possibly he wouldn't die, otherwise he would become a vegetable and I would be seeing him, separated from him and feeling that he no longer belonged to them. He didn't like the idea. He opened his eyes, He felt dizzy and couldn't come back. He tried to shout at Henri, but nothing came out of him. He turned to look at his around and held firmly onto the table. He felt that he could return, but at the same time he could leave. Soon Henri returned, and that made Pedro's temper return. Forces. He felt safe. His body belonged to him again. He tried to speak but gave up doing so. He remembered the words of Fulob. He who knows does not speak. It was dangerous to speak, even Henri, since he would see him as sick and that would be disastrous. At that moment Helda arrived. She sat between the two, and he started talking to Henri. He asked her what she was doing. Henri replied that she was transmitting a musical message and that a third of it was still missing. Henri stood up and went in search of another recording. They placed it on the record player, and loud music played through it. The loudspeakers. Pedro made a face of disgust. He didn't. I liked that music. Helda and Henri looked at each other, and then left the room. Pedro tried to make sense of the new music, but she only spoke to him about depressing matters. She told him that her body was his, and that he should not abandon it. He spoke to her about the future, and tried to convince him that this was it, dirty and smelly, and that the only possible solution was stop searching and stay permanently in a state stable. Pedro walked away from the music, got up from his seat, and went to the bathroom. When he came out, Henri and Helda were there, waiting. Henri showed him a black object. Pedro took it, and he noticed that it was a cube made of coal, smooth surface, but full of imperfections. The dark tones seemed to be distributed in areas of greater or lesser blackness. He explained to him that it was one of the most extraordinary examples of physical purity. The coal was 99.999999% pure. The dimensions of the edges and borders did not differ in more of a millionth of an inch. The faces had been polished by using a computer. Peter could not believe what he heard. Here, from the point of view of physics, that object, and yet he saw it completely imperfect. I didn't understand why, if that cube was smooth and polished like a mirror, he saw it so poorly built and almost rough. This, said Henri, proves that contrary to what we assume, the brain is very simple in its functioning, and, more than that, imperfect. Why? Asked Pedro. He adjusted his glasses, changed the position of the rocking chair, and with his usual smile he said, because we complicate everything. Pedro started to laugh. He couldn't help the joy that felt. He understood the reason why the third part of Henri's message had not pleased him. Henri turned around in surprise to see Peter, and made a questioning gesture. Peter, he began to rock in his chair, and using very clear words he said to himself, be careful what you say in that moment, use concepts that he understands. Listen, Henri, he said to her at last. Of course the world is very simple. In essence it only consists of several elementary particles arranged in thousands of geometric shapes. Our brain complicates these forms, and builds objects by separating them of others, and giving them an appearance of stiffness and color, but this makes it a very complicated instrument, and not simple mechanism as you said. Henri smiled. You're right, she said. It's truly complicated in its operation, and not as simple as before I said, especially since the world is not made up of several elementary particles but of one what is. The third part of the message continued to sound through the loudspeakers. Pedro was starting to like that music, when Henri told him that it was the right time to go to the meeting, but that they would eat something first. The party was held on the third floor of the same building where Pedro, Henri, and Helda were eating. The music could be heard from the street, and in a room people were dancing. Pedro peeked out to see them, and tried to understand what they conveyed with their movements. Henri called Pedro into the kitchen. He was presented with a girl with short hair, and green eyes named Raya. She was excretory. Within 30 seconds they both realized both. Pedro found it delightful to talk to Raya and told her what he felt with the spiral. They both brought their heads together until they touched one another. It is very interesting, said Pedro, that when you arrive to the situation of being able to decide whether to stay here or go to whom you know where, the media appears. Sometimes one returns because he is afraid to see his dead body. In others, the prospect of being reborn frightens. Sometimes the idea that expansion will reach the limits of the universe. I think, continued Peter, that it is most likely that what happens is that one sees one's body, or that the body sees one. It is a kind of alternative in which one of the two parts are left with the feeling of being. I wouldn't like it keep the body, but I still hesitate to leave with it another. That's why I always come back. Raya looked directly into Peter's eyes, took his hand, and began to relate an experience. One night I was with a friend and suddenly I started to feel a kind of spiral similar to yours. I decided to let go, but, like you, I got fear. I wanted to go back, but I had gone so far that I could go back. All night I spent arm in arm with my friend and without saying a word. I was afraid that when I spoke the decision to leave faded, but because it was already too much later, I would be left with an empty body. Pedro felt a great tenderness, stroked Raya's hair, and wished he had been the friend told her she was very sweet. She returned to the room, music, and saw a girl sitting on the floor. He felt the beauty of this being and dedicated herself to observing it. The girl he saw, the dancers, and a burly black man caught his attention. That when dancing, it conveyed scenes of lovemaking. Pedro noticed the sparkle in the girl's eyes and noticed her desire to dance with the black man. At that moment, he approached her and with a gesture invited her. It was magical. Complexity of the transmission. Peter rejoiced at what I saw. Each movement represented a world, and each combination of steps, the manifestation of a logic particular thought. After a few minutes, both of them, the girl and that giant, were making love while dancing. Pedro, he closed his eyes and let the music provoke visuals inside. For a moment he saw the staircase again and began to climb the steps. He remembered the conversation with Raya, and not wanting to continue, opened her eyes, stood up seat and began to dance. The girl had disappeared. In the kitchen we talked about the essence of being. Pedro sat down and paid attention. The same girl from the dance was speaking. He was commenting on the need to be himself, and said he would ask her name. The girl, he told her, Allison. Allison tried to convince those who listened to her. She said that the last step of inner development is reached when one accepts one's own particular determinism, when one realizes that it is the result of a culture and environment, individuals. Pedro listened, bored. He approached Allison and asked him if he had ever felt like he was detaching himself from herself. She replied with a negative and began to listen attentively to Peter. He asked again, "Have you ever been able to destroy any learning? Childish?" "Of course," Allison replied. "That means," said Peter, "that we are not what we are. We have been taught that we can put an end to it and not disappear by doing so." Allison stood there thinking. Her long dark hair caressed his cheeks. Suddenly approached Pedro, and gently taking his hands, she said in a whisper, I learned to respect what surrounded me as a child. I understood the wisdom of my environment, and I loved my parents for having been able to transmit it to you. It's not something I want to destroy, but on the contrary, to understand and develop." Pedro loved Allison. He didn't want her to leave there. I knew there was a treasure in that face and that body. Without, however, they came for her, and she left. James, the host, came to greet Pedro, and told him that the weather was extraordinary that had happened, talking with Raya and Allison, and that it was amazing that someone could stay for more than 2 hours talking about unreal matters, and at the same time entertained by them. Peter was petrified. He knew that James was not an ordinary guy, but behold, he had not been imagined that I could be awake enough to say that. He understood why everyone seemed to love him so much. The night air was delicious, you could smell the river, and one last night was cool. Pedro said goodbye to Henri and Helda. He thanked her for her invitation and went home. He dreamed all night about Allison. He remembered the excitement that he had felt when she confided in him about her childhood love, and realized that in the conversation she had mentioned that he wrote music, and that in that creation he had mentioned herself. The morning was sad. Peter woke up tired and feeling the onset of depression. Suddenly he remembered his camera and felt an overwhelming desire to go out with she to take pictures. He rode his bike, and when he reached the metal bridge, he prepared to take the first view. He focused on the network floor of steel, and let the image of the river that was seen below the net penetrated the chamber. It reached a small garden, and he marveled at the sight of an old man who thoughtfully looked at the past. He placed the old man in the center of the sight and blurred the garden. What I saw through the optics of the instrument left completely satisfied. He returned home at 10 o'clock at night. He found Ron and his wife listening to music in the first-floor living room. As always, he found Fulob playing chess and listening to Bach. He sat on the floor and let Rob ask him where he had gone. Pedro described the photographs he had taken, and Ron began, as always, to try to make a neurophysiological analysis of perceptual processes. Something that has always seemed wonderful to me, he said, Rob, is our brain's ability to create models of perfection. We somehow manage logical rules which are unquestionable for their neatness and accuracy. For example, before taking an object in our hand, we visualize the entire trajectory of the same, and only after this vision, we send the logical orders of movements that transform abstract vision into tangible reality. Such it seems that the path to development is to achieve a coupling between our motor processes and the rules and abstract sequences that precede them. Since from this point of view, a baby could possess a machinery, exquisite abstractions, and simply learn to transform these realities. I think you're right, said Peter. Something like that. It could be associated with our use of language. We can imagine ourselves in a very complicated situation because of the number of elements it contains, and by the interactions of these, however, it is very difficult for us to verbalize all of this internal content. We learn to use a language to transform our abstractions into linguistic realities, but we do not learn to have the abstractions. They are already there since always. What do you mean by that? Rob said angrily. It would seem that you are accepting the existence of something that is there since before birth. The idea seems false to me, and it also crashes into me. Now I'm the one who doesn't understand you, said Lunif. I'll explain it to you, Rob replied. Our evolution is the development of our potential, but nothing is complete at birth. If that were the case, we would have to stay their state. That's what doesn't match what you said, Rob continued, since you are implying that that is already it is there from birth. Peter understood what Rob didn't mean. This made us start judging and interpreting it. Precisely at that moment, I was considering the possibility that Rob might not have fully awakened. That's why he wanted to put him to test and ask them, "Aren't you happy when you return to your childhood?" Rob answered yes and smiled with a big smile manifestation of joy. Peter interpreted Rob's joy as a sign that he had recognized his mistake and was now thinking how beautiful it was to return to the starting point, to the essence without learnings. In reality, Rob was simply remembering his childhood. Pedro interrupted Rob's footage to tell him that all cultures follow the path towards the essence. Rob's wife added, "But there are exceptions, for example the 18th century. "That's right," said Peter. "There are exceptions and there are falls, but that's the way." Although things are currently divided, some believe that it consists of returning to the essence and a superculture. Peter stopped talking and started thinking. It gives the impression that we are at the beginning doubt the division of the human species into two subspecies, that of the spirit and that of the return to nature. Those who think about the return love children, reproduce, and will be the only ones that they survive. In Fabio, those of the spirit do not like the body, and even less, even from their dependencies. They have no children, and are limited to dying one by one. They will disappear. At that moment Pedro understood what Ina wanted for him. Say when showing him the coal bucket, Henri represented a subspecies and Rob the other. Henri loved nature and saw the imperfection of the human being trying to know it, and only launched false hypotheses. The man, according to Henri, was supposed to return to the stage prior to all learning. Rob, on the other hand, worshipped logical perfection. His way, it was that of conceptual superdevelopment. Pedro looked at his hands, moved them. He looked at his eyes, moved them. He looked at his arms and legs, moved them. He looked at himself, and didn't know who he was. The soldier. The storm had lasted all day. No one dared to go home because they expected a huge traffic jam in transit. Finally, at 10 o'clock at night, they decided. When they reached 72nd Street, Juan stopped the car. He had recognized the Viennese pastry, and an irrepressible desire took hold of him. 5 minutes later he returned with a wine-soaked cake. From the boat you could see the skyscrapers, and Juan couldn't hide his emotion. Feeling alive and back made him cry. He didn't even notice that no one had come to receive it. I had never been able to eat such a huge cake. I knew that the stomach pain would be enormous, but nothing would prevent him from fulfilling the wish that he had had for 2 years since. Every bite made him go back to images and sensations that they did not want to remember, but that at that moment, they came to him and invaded him. The only joy of those icy nights was talking to Luis. His large glasses almost hid his bright eyes and constantly moving. It was very lucky that they were sent together on that mission, because this made him forget the danger. When they reached the hill, they decided to separate. Juan would go north and Luis would give a detour. They said goodbye and agreed on the meeting place. Luis did not appear. Juan was waiting for him sitting on a rock. After 24 hours of delay, Juan decided to go in her search. Traveling the return path was not easy, but the idea that something had happened to Luis pierced his mind. Brain. After 3 hours a glow made Juan hide behind a tree. If what he saw flashing was an enemy patrol was lost. The silence was total, and Juan didn't dare make any movement. The flickering was still in the same place. He took his binoculars and realized that what he saw was the reflection of the sun in some glasses. Juan shot out of his hiding place. Luis was lying down in the middle of the forest, and the remains of his glasses were found scattered around him. One approached his wife's body friend. The latter tried to make a move, but the effort caused him such sharp pain that he began to moan. 30 meters away, Luis had felt the presence of John. Knowing that the first thing he would do would be lift it off the ground, and that this would detonate the grenade hand that the bastards had placed under his body wounded, he decided. With the maximum power of his muscles torn, he managed to turn around. Juan didn't understand where the explosion had come from. The only thing he could see was a big flash accompanied from the instant destruction of his friend's body. Juan ordered a Viennese coffee. The prospect of the sweet taste and hot filled him with a childlike joy. He fought against the "I remember," and for a moment I could taste a piece of pastel. The news spread throughout the battalion. Legume Smith had found a treasure. No soldier was so naive enough to tell the sergeant the news, so that Smith's discovery was transmitted with great precautions. At 10 o'clock at night, everyone was gathered in that clearing in the middle of the forest. Smith showed them what he had found. A rather unpretentious calculation indicated that each soldier would receive a sum close to 5 million of German marks. Of course, it wouldn't be easy to change the money, but what left no room for doubt was that the German population. I would accept it with much greater confidence than the coin of the occupation. One thought about what he could do with that money. Probably buy a house, spend it on women, or simply exchange it for services. Everyone expected that someone decided, but no one did. At 2 in the tomorrow, they arranged all the bills in a big pile and they set them on fire. One lit a cigarette. In front of him was sitting a woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, beautiful. Walking through the cobbled streets had been a delight. The fresh air and the uniform made for a cheerful combination. Juan had never been to Paris, and he had never imagined the existence of so many women beautiful. The most incredible thing was that it was enough to greet them, for they would agree to make love, in a kind of gratitude for having saved them from Nazi terror. After all, thought Juan, that's how it should be. Always things full of love. Juan finished his coffee and cake, got up from his chair, and approaching the girl, he greeted her. He stood there halfway return. Juan realized that the war was over. The experiment, the mind-brain duality is about to disappear, announced the director of the institute. The idea is mature, and the theoretical conception is logical and well-grounded. All that is required is an experiment to confirm it. The appointment was set for 11 in the morning. The next day, Rubios would be in charge of carrying out the search and record the data. Audrey would be the subject and would try to obtain the state-specific essential to carry out the transmission. Audrey arrived 20 minutes late and found Rufus writing. At 12, the amplifiers were calibrated, and the electrodes were placed in position. At 30 minutes, the drug was injected, and electronic music began to play through the headphones. Audrey began to lose track of time. She heard the music in the center of his head, and the notes and rhythms made strange images appear. A heart beat slowly and rhythmically. The volume it rose until in a low-toned climax someone woke up. The words he spoke were not clear, but Audrey overheard a conversation in which the vigil he was talking about a trip he had taken and the state of madness in which he found himself after the same. For Audrey the meaning was clear, the music had a message, and this was the story of an expansion. Suddenly, the sound of someone running desperately was heard. His breathing was rapid and deep. It was, without a doubt, the transmission of the search process. Audrey stopped listening to music as such, and became the theme and the message. It was seen in the process of search. As always, he entered a labyrinth gigantic. His own heart slowed its rate beats until the interval between one and the other became longer enough to make him feel uncomfortable. It was a feeling of death that advanced until become something so tangible and real that it made him tremble fear. What would follow was absolutely predictable, or accepted terror and understood it, or fought against it. The first possibility would take him to conceptual paradise, second to nothing. Audrey decided to accept the feeling, and it began to disappear. At that instant, a sound mixed from clocks and bells, he created geometric figures that they danced in a zigzag pattern, reflecting various colors. The search seemed to be over, and what was found it was the pleasure of the appearance of visual images. Audrey felt happy, forgot that his brain was being analyzed, and lived the colors and visual shapes as a sweetest nectar. The encounter lasted a few minutes. Audrey realized that the search must continue. He shouted to Rufus, asking him to stop the search. He placed the recording of Bach's last composition and set out to continue. The prospect of hearing that music produced a beautiful excitement that was transmitted to every muscle of the Audrey's body. He remembered what he had heard about the composition, and an image appeared before his eyes. A room lined with walls and ceilings with a block of precious wood, a multicolored window that broke up the sunlight, reflecting the interior of the room, blue, red, yellow, and green. Next to a wall, a large bed with a feather mattress, and lying on a cushion, an old man, blind and about to die. Next to the bed, a young man puts on paper the last musical thoughts of his father. Mixed with the musical notes, they appeared in the lined paper with handwritten instructions. The last of them, he said, "These chords were written at the time when my father, Johann Sebastian Bach, has passed away. They represent his latest ideas and visions." Audrey didn't like the music. It was too loud, structured and formal. It seemed to him that the composer was defending an intellectual position, and that he did it even last moment. However, there was one exception. 2 minutes before he died, the music had become disorganized. It was not something casual or random, but rather voluntary and conscious. Bach had explored a new possibilistic but had become repentant. The last chords returned to the structure. Audrey felt compassion. It was a heretical emotion, considering that it was Bach, but someone who was not dared to search and stayed on one path, not deserved something else. Audrey's head started to hurt. He called Rufo and told him about his experiences. Rufo looked very impressed. Audrey's brain activity was very strange and aberrant. They decided to continue with another recording. With the Mas Pange Lingua, Audrey felt better. From the first note he realized that Desprez did not like it. They liked games. There was something absolutely authentic about the broadcast. And that is why the author had titled it For All Languages. Audrey settled into her seat and prepared for a true experience. The image of a valley appeared. A multitude of paths, cobbled and dusty roads crisscrossed it in all directions. A rider on a mule was traveling along one of the roads. Audrey approached the character and realized that her clothing corresponded to the era of the music. The gentleman's face was beautiful, but he remained contracted and frowning, as if a grave worry tormented him. Audrey tried to get into the rider, and in doing so he saw himself working in the small-town blacksmith shop. A red-hot horseshoe alive rested on an anvil, and Audrey hit it with a large hammer. The muscles in his arms were swollen, and his body completely drenched in sweat. The work was tiring and boring, but the possibility of belonging to the guild and opening his own workshop excited that medieval Audrey. The only truly attractive thing it was music. You could play with it and at the same time learn. The church organ was built of wood. Each of its tubes produced a delicious sound, and Audrey he was in charge of playing during religious ceremonies. Everyone recognized his ability, and always listened with attention to the maestro's musical experiments. He had a talent for transmitting mystical experiences. The priest spoke of life in hell and in the paradise. He said that there is something that persists after death, and that something still lives on. The music that Audrey listened to explained life after death. Audrey returned to the lab. She had always played the thought of death. However, there had never been seriously considered the possibility that it might not end in the complete nullification. At that moment I had to find out. He no longer had the possibility. So he assumed it, and tried to analyze it objectively. The truth of things, he thought, is that life after death is as improbable as the existence of a subjective experience. However, we consider this one real and possible, and that one fantastic and absurd. From a physical point of view, there is a possibility that the information in the brain is independent of the elements that form its structure. The logical thought that the neuronal activity creates an energy field that, once formed, becomes independent of the brain structure that gave rise to it. There is no theoretical impediment that could deny the possibility that the field thus formed contains information in itself, and that relates to the elements that they created as a radio transmission with the transmitter same. In other words, he continued thinking, the subjective information could exist in itself once the neuronal structure that causes it dies. However, the possibility was a reduction to absurd. The only thing that would remain would be information, monotonously stable and unviable until the end of the times. Audrey dismissed the possibility. She didn't like the perspective, and also lived, and that was the important thing. An immense joy filled him and made him feel full and complete. The Mass was a hymn to life, and all its complexity. It was the possibility of living it in complete isolation from everything conventionality and illusion, but without change. However, the music continued, and that meant the message had not concluded. Audrey redoubled her attention and tried to understand. Infinite changes, changes of rhythm, tonality and conceptual scheme, increasingly majestic changes and universal. A thought arose. Audrey hadn't called, nor did I wish it to arrive, but it was clear and obvious about all that. Obviously. A constantly expanding field in space interacts with other fields, gravitational, magnetic, etc. This produces thousands and thousands of altercations. Audrey felt calm, there was nothing to fear. After 72 hours, the electrodes were placed again, in position. The recording was analyzed, and as no one was found, no potentially dangerous portion was continued with the second part of the experiment. Audrey sat inside the silent chamber. Silence and black darkness surrounded him. Suddenly he felt a slight tingling all over his scalp. It was the signal that indicated that his brain was being stimulated with his same activity. Audrey couldn't believe her own sensations. He felt his brain running through his own development. He saw himself as the benchmark for a newborn. Everything was being without words and without thoughts. Then the feeling of greater anguish began to appear that Audrey could ever remember having lived. The details were not perceptible, only the experience of loss and destruction. The reference point being was destroyed, and in its place appeared fear. Fear of fear, terror of terror, loss of being. Suddenly the fear disappeared. There was a soft emptiness, and I'm sure it would fill it. Audrey calmed down. She didn't understand what meant that, but he was sure that there was no more danger. His point of reference had changed, now it was that woman who fed him. Audrey let her be, enjoying it without inhibitions. I depended on that heat and that smell. there was nothing more important and necessary. But that it didn't last long. The other things started again. Fear. But Audrey was prepared. She knew that feeling would end to give birth to something. Knowledge helped him not to get lost in anguish. Anguish. Now it was the singularity. It was very strange that there was appeared at such a young age, but there it was, there was no doubt. Audrey had to be different, smarter, original, shy, whatever, as long as the difference existed. That was the new point of reference, the only meaning and purpose of your life. He remembered everything, his friends, his eccentric gestures, his opinions and ideas. Whenever Audrey remembered something about herself, same, that feeling appeared. Audrey tried all the ways of being different, and finally found one that satisfied him completely. It was a mixture of respect for learning, self-affirmation, and absolute disregard for the outside world. Audrey believed being Audrey when she forgot about the world. That was her new reference point. Suddenly, the reason for the changes became clear, represented stages of development. The reference points were only integrations of the origin and the basis of a stage. First being, then dependence, later originality, and finally self-affirmation and abandonment of structures and their inclusion, the world. Except for the passage from being to dependence, the journey was expansive. The new reference point always included the previous ones as particular and concrete cases. Audrey understood that that would be the new reference point, expansion. Audrey called Rubo, asked him to disconnect the recorder. Rufus asked them the reason for their desire. Audrey, she looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I'm not interested anymore. Follow the experiment." The writer. The author sat down to write a story. His own. He remembered everything he had understood. As, at first, his explanations were superficial and false, and the way in which they were becoming something clear, and more than anything obvious. His childhood. Before he would not have been able to say nothing about her. But now, when I understood so many things, now he could remember her. He took his pen and began to write. The adults tried to become children to talk with us, but they were always false since they invented a child to become. The writer put down his pen. The last sentences immersed in a series of thoughts that led him to understand your ability to write. I understood my childhood as a false communication with the world. The ability understanding it that way is what makes me write. I can see the childhood of characters, and it is enough for me to know the rule of a relationship to develop all the details about the same. But this is not only a specific condition of writing, it is more than anything the way we function. We just remember something when we are able to understand it. This does not mean that it will not be possible, at some stage, to remember something without understand it. It only means that the compression of a stage of our life brings forth in us a whole series of events that would never appear if it were not for that understanding. The memories that appear from the understand are those that were experienced as key parts of prolonged after run. In other words, those that produced changes and therefore were not understood when they happened. The writer had to lie. What is really unsightly, saying would not be understood if I stated it directly. I had to subtly include it in a specific story. It was a shame, and it took work, but if the reader did not live the details from at first, he would not make it his own. And that was the only authentic thing to him that could be aspired to. The writer took up his pen and continued writing. In my childhood, I lived in a very big house surrounded by gardens. The hunt. The hunt began in the morning. The grasslands, they looked like a sea when at dusk, the wind caressed them, producing slow, rhythmic oscillations. In the village, nets and boomerangs were prepared. 5 bronze men, tanned and dressed in loincloths, would lead the march. It would be a nice day. It was the time of year when the kangaroos gathered in the valley, and that made them vulnerable. Everyone got ready, and after painting half of face, they went out. They would pass near the sacred trees, and that always made them nervous. The reason was simple: no, their names could be mentioned. The child was subjected to the most complex ritual. 3 rabbis forming an equilateral triangle prayed while the congregation read the sacred books. The child had been shaved and constantly repeated a phrase in Hebrew, without understanding it. The laws are clear in this regard, the scholars commented. Scriptures forbid mentioning the sacred name of God, and that child had transgressed the teachings. You mean, Elba asked Car, our ability to remember our history, or our intellectual conception of a self? The only thing I want you to understand, he answered Kay, is that despite our changes always we keep something that remains stable, and that something is the sense of self. Elba thought that was ridiculous and let her know. Car, I am not the same as yesterday, and even less the same as I was in my childhood, he added with a smile. If you think so, I am. You're wrong. That's not what I meant, he got annoyed. Car, it is obvious that there is a development and that we have the possibility of change. What I mean is that, despite of these changes, there is something that remains constant in us. What's more, Carr continued, I feel that my life has a purpose, which is to find out and understand that which remains unchanged in me. I believe that when I achieve, something very important will happen to me. Elba stopped smiling. Carr's words had made her impressed. I felt there was a message that wasn't entirely clear in them. He swallowed and dared to ask which one it was. He swallowed saliva and dared to ask what it was. Carr first perceived the possibility of convey that to him. He knew he had realized that transforms all that complexity into language was a impossible and absurd undertaking. Words kill the spirit, that's why they are so dangerous. Carr tried to put his ideas in order. By naming something, all its complex content is lost and only remains, but never the real meaning. The argument with Elba had arisen for this very reason. Listen to this, Carr said finally. I don't know how to explain it to you. The only thing I can do is try to provoke in you what I feel is obvious. Think for a moment, continued, in some very old experience. Elba closed the eyes and nodded. That's it, Carr told him. Now think about what you felt. During that experience, is there anything from that time that remains living in you? Elba nodded again. Then, she said, Carr, you already understood what I wanted to say. Elba smiled. You're glad you didn't use words, he said. I wouldn't have achieved with them. From a very young age, the children of the tribe were subjected to a very rigorous training. They had to learn to understand all the symbols that 30 generations of ancestors had developed. It was a gigantic undertaking because the words had been banned, that is, those that reduced complexity to a category. Reuben's head hurt. No one had loved him. Explain the meaning of the ceremony. When they shaved him, he had objected and shouted, but no one had helped him. I must have committed a great sin, he thought. But I don't know what it is, and I don't understand all this fuss either. That feels like the world is about to end. Reuben didn't understand. The organist. Dark and a person standing by the door collecting the entrance fee. Noise, infernal noise of organ, electric guitar, saxophone and drums. Dark tables and dark chairs. A platform in the background illuminated with red reflections of cigarette smoke. I approach the bar and observe with surprise that the place closest to the set is empty. I think it is intended for me and I sit down. Suddenly I realize the organist, being huge, fat, black, with a shaved head and dark beard against a background of rings, necklaces and earrings. His face is a fire of sudden and isochronous contractions. Eyes close every time he plays a low tone. The guitarist hides behind him, anonymous, leaning on one of his team's speakers, with a face of boredom and an idiotic expression in his eyes. The saxophonist sees but is not visible, only an empty body. The music is strange, and the musicians even more so. I'm tired of I see them and turn to see a table. As always, a woman, but this is a Greek reminiscence. Completely motionless and beautiful, she remains listening to the music. From time to time, every now and then, he smiles and nods. I can't stop to see her and be amazed by her calm, her beauty and her contact and understanding with what surrounds you. The ensemble has stopped playing. The organist smokes a cigarette and drinks a bottle. Suddenly he stops drinking, and he is busy tuning his instrument. He touches one button and then another, and the low tones it produces seem to displease him. He returns to try it, change the position of 3 switches and repeat the notes from before. A low wailing wail is heard, and a look of perplexity appears on his face. He puts out his cigarette and again plays the same notes. It's an interesting topic. I hope he continues with it. The organist seems to be in agreement. I agree with you, since it begins to develop the theme that he has discovered. The notes rise and fall. The low tones intermingle to produce the most complex ones, arabesques. The guitarist, who until then had remaining motionless and with his gaze lost, he begins to interested in new music, and to prove it he begins to play. The original theme remains in the organist's possession. The relationship of notes seems to be so powerful that the face of this one enters into a burst of paroxysmal contractions, which, reaching a climax, they dissipate in a spasmodic journey from the keyboard. The guitarist begins a dialogue with a being imaginary. His mouth and eyes wake up, and after a brief silence begins to develop a new theme. Its music is of high tones that dance in voluptuous scales, until become a continuous and desperate change. The organist does not give in to the invitation, maintains the original theme, and in moments seems to be annoyed by the appearance of the new and original development. The saxophonist, who until then had remained accompanying the organist, he became interested by the guitarist. First, he makes a timid attempt at direction of the high tones, but regrets it and continues with the organist. He maintains a clear competition with the guitarist. Both defend their songs and do not reach an agreement. Suddenly the saxophonist makes up his mind, reinforces his high tones, and adopts the guitarist's theme. The two, they develop the same degree of communication, which reaches very intense levels. Changes are happening ever more rapidly, and which at first was a clear and transparent sequence of sounds, now acquires a force and power that makes it appear disorganized and haphazard. The organist seems to be very worried and think that the music he hears is manifestation of degeneration. He tells his companions, the tones that come out of the organ, in responses, are of a intensity and frequency such that they are almost visible. The organist repeats the message but realizes that it does not interest the other musicians. These are lost in a universe of sounds, and the only thing that interests them is that these do not disappear. The organist knows what is happening to them and tries to bring them back, realizes that they are on the verge of losing their body, and he starts saying not to do it, that there is nothing else complex to handle, and that with something simpler, they will feel boring. At that moment, the drummer starts playing. It's like a pacifying signal. Both contenders stop, compete, and rest. The drummer's sounds are a question. They pose the competition between the organist and the guitarist as absurd and question its validity. The organist understands the message and decides to change attitude, he tells the guitarist, who accepts the change. The organist continues playing, asking for calm and understanding. He tells the guitarist that to get where he wants, music is enough. It is also necessary to maintain a certain discipline, enough to avoid falling into an abyss. The guitarist accepts the message, and everyone joins in on the song. Original, ending with it, the composition. I order a drink. While I savor it, I reconstruct the music and the dialogue that has developed before my eyes. I think the power of music and its power is extraordinary. Ability to convey messages, I get gagas, dedicate myself to it, and thus feel its magic and its power. There is no doubt that these musicians talk to each other, they discuss and dialogue. I don't understand the content of their messages. I am only able to see their manifestations, and the intricate and complex operations that produce them. It is the same feeling as walking down a city street unknown. The people you see are actors and characters that manifest life and interaction, but the content of this it is not heard, and it is not heard because at that level it does not matter. The night is warm. I thank Sam for taking me to my house. Choose the route that runs along the river. The view of the lights reflecting on its surface is so comforting that invites a calm dialogue. Sam talks about the origin of that music. It started, he says, when someone was brave enough as to move away from any fixed and strict fabric, when it was capable of considering himself the decider and master of his own musical messages. This, he repeats, was the beginning of such music. The extraordinary happened when dozens of artists understood this message and joined him. In that moment, music stopped being a game and became free manifestation of internal universes. You're right, I said, Rowe. What used to be submission to authoritarian forms and laws was broken, and from there a whole musical movement emerged that tends to liberate the music of its origins, turning it into a free manifestation of emotions, sensations, and even states of knowledge. If this path has continued, the music we just finished listening must be on the frontier of the development of those musicians, and as such, rethink a new creation and not a reminiscence of past learning. Whatever they may be, I continued, these musicians must be very happy. Sam laughed. I agree in principle with what you say, he admitted, but I don't think they will stay in a constant state of happiness. If that were the case, his music would be very boring. Rather, he continued, they talk about what has happened to them occurred, sometimes due to injustice, racial discrimination, despair and pain, others of love, desire, religion. What they have developed is certainly an amazing ability to express and communicate all these experiences. Then, your music, I said, scared, is approaching themselves so much that they reach the highest states of complexity. No, Sam corrected, it's still too simple. The madman. The only thing that was known about him was that he had been gone for 2 weeks, had appeared in the village carrying that wall clock, and which since that date had been installed at one end of the main square. There he ate, slept and lived. On one occasion the guards they had interrogated him, asking for his papers, identification, finding them in order, and not having no legal provision prohibiting living in the square, had left in peace. Everyone was talking about his dirty and sickly appearance, and about all of the big wall clock. The village children went in the mornings to the square, and sitting on the grass, they watched the strange way in which that old man followed with his gaze the clockwise movement. At dinner time in the village houses, the children they told their parents what they had seen, and they, alarmed, they asked them questions. Are you sure that always look at it differently? Is it true that kneels down? and kisses him? In cafes and at parties, the meaning of that clock and its owner. Some said it was a old-school teacher obsessed with the idea of death and time. Others claimed that he was an emissary from the sky trying to convey a message to them. Most of them, however, he believed that he was simply a madman who believed that his watch had life. One night, after a meeting in which there had been having discussed the probable origin of that strange being, elected a citizens' commission charged with going to ask him directly. The commission agreed to accomplish that task that same night. I remember the times you showed it to me. They were wonderful. Understood everyone explained himself, and the sounds of their places appeared clear and linked together with others. The wind was felt and the music became a companion and friend. The birds answered, and in doing so, they responded questions. No one was like you, and you were not like anyone else. It was. And that's what matters. I thank you for all this, my dear friend. But I wish to tell you something very serious. Every step in my awakening was to try different paths that explored his latest consequences. He understood it, and then destroyed its last consequences. I understood it, and then destroyed it as I wished. That made me grow and know what I was capable of. It was beautiful, but each of these births and these deaths were painful and distressing. Now here I am, talking to you and asking you for reasons for your behavior. But even if you don't believe it, I need your help. I have always believed that it is necessary to take the last step, because that is what will complete the quest and bring the answer. The last step? Asked the clock. Yes, said the old man. The last one. The Electra Commission went out in search of the old man. His steps on the pavement and their talk spread smoky vapors and strange noises that expanded in spheres until reaching great distances. Thank you, the old man said with great emotion to his clock. You have always answered me when I have spoken to you, and now your answer is those voices and those noises, they take you away. Or tell me that there are other worlds besides this one mine, and whose, they give me something to think about, and they offer me the alternative in the world, but it doesn't satisfy me. I'm starting to see myself, and what I could achieve with them, and that, it makes me sick. So your answer hasn't been found in me, place. What other answer is there? I ask you now, tell me, please. At 11 o'clock sharp, the commission was petrified. Approach the square and hear that sound of bells that seemed to come from nowhere. The sound was joyful and they sang, but their volume was thunderous. The members of the commission were frightened, and when they arrived at the delegation, told everything that had happened. The news spread so quickly that within 15 minutes 20 women, they came demanding that the crazy witch be thrown out of the town. The sound of the bells had transfigured the old man. His wrinkled face smiled and his eyes seemed to see things that did not exist. Images of his life appeared before him, his first minutes, what I felt, the being in essence. Afterwards, his early years, his life as a child, the games and tricks, joys and destructions. Little by little he began to talk to himself. It was the only one who understood it. Everyone was strange and enemy. In meeting with his partner, the years of experience in the world, and the terrible disappointment they brought with them. Everything that, so clear and transparent, was the clock's response. Images followed, the voluntary separation from the world, the living in isolation for years without really speaking is really no one, the state of wisdom that he believed he had reached after those years, and the collapse of everything, the morning in who realized that he actually knew nothing, and the Renaissance. It saw its first steps in its rediscovery of the world, in his contact and trust with people, his faith that he told him that everyone was equal to him, and again the destruction of cheese. What followed was a time of waiting, dark and full of swings, until he realized that a clock was the answer. The image of the watch shop and its instant infatuation with that old giant clock wall appeared before his eyes. He took it home and placed it in a corner of the living room. In the evenings he would sit in the rocking chair and lull himself to sleep. Deep, rhythmic ticking of that machine. One day the clock he began to speak to him, and what he said was wisdom and knowledge. At that moment what was being prepared happens for years, the appearance of a master who understood. His watch had been his life, his lover, his friend and his father, all at different times and eras. Only once did they argue. It happened that the obsession with stopping time had taken hold of the owner of that watch, and of course, that had caused this one some discomfort and sadness. But for general relief, the obsession disappeared, and order and love reappeared in the relationship. From that moment on, wonders began to happen. All possible emotions were experienced. All the pleasures and sweetnesses were savored, and each one of them taught a new path, opened a different universe that to know. Things were understood instantly upon seeing them. The obvious resulted anywhere. All the games and traps were they observed and analyzed to their ultimate consequences. Of power. Try as I might, said Hans, I can't find a sufficiently logical and obvious argument. Me neither, Ull replied. And the reason is that it is found associated with all activity. I don't quite understand you, said Hans, with a gesture of amazement. It's as clear as day, Ull replied. The idea of power is in any activity. The power to create, the power to be free, the power to paint or fly or write or believe is always the power, although the activity varies. You're absolutely right, Hans said, although I must admit that the idea is not entirely pleasant to me. That's it, said Ull, because of your personal history, but not so it is. And what is it? Hans asked irritably. Power, Ull replied, and they both laughed mockingly. Deaf, the teacher. When I run through the grass and the smell of earth and the moisture of the dew permeates me, I think of the teacher, the one who, having traveled 1,000 roads, knows which one is the next state and recognize what it will lead to, the one who never he denies, knowing that beyond the game is the question. I think of the master, acceptor of errors and knower of essences that never does not preach or provide data. It simply knows, listens, sees and sometimes nods. When I think of the teacher, and I look around for him, I feel sad. The knower of paths and knower of essences is and is not. It is there when I see it, and it is not there when I fall asleep, the teacher. The man. Listen, he said in an energetic tone but with a smile. When I talk to someone, I am the subject, and he is object. When someone speaks to me, however, he is the subject and I the object. The object and the subject are me, or it is him when I speak, or he speaks to me. That's what is said, and that's how I describe it, even though the reality will be somewhat different. There is neither subject nor object, and the most. The indisputable fact is that I myself can be the object of myself, being myself a subject, or I can believe myself to be a subject, being only an object. When someone understands it, he knows that the true state of consciousness is that in which the object and the subject disappear. The room was covered with carpets. Spread across them dozens of men and women barefoot and in position of lotus. The interpreter approached the large white armchair, in which a dark-skinned man with gold glasses and semi-silver hair was sitting. The second question was translated. The man laughed. Before answering, he arranged his grey beard and said, "After from the moment when you understand that nothing is a coincidence, two things can happen. The first is to stop searching and start savor the particular cases that teach and clarify connections. The second is to keep looking for what, because it is a search, it cannot be found." A woman was gesturing with her hands, brought it up to the face and placing one on each cheek. It swung head from side to side. The man's eyes looked at the woman and asked her what was wrong. She approached him and, prostrating himself before him, he communicated to him through the interpreter, who did not understand why he who was searching did not find. "The reason is simple," he explained. "He who seeks believes know what you want to find, and when you don't find it you assume that can't find it and keeps looking. What surrounds him he answers, but he is not even able to hear that answer. So deafened is he by the other, the one who expects to hear." Once the interpreter translated the answer, the woman he smiled as if he understood, but asked again what is expected to hear. The man took pity on her, and making a huge effort, he answered them. What is expected to be heard is what is recognized as an object of the search. What one believes one will find when one find. The woman smiled again. The man stared at her into her eyes and took pity on her again. He pointed out a place on the carpet and asked him to stop talking and listen. The interpreter translated again. From the man's gestures I could know that the question just posed was simple. When I see another man's forehead, I perceive a light that emerges from its center. When I look into its eyes, the light changes color and takes on fantastic shapes. That's not can achieve a machine no matter how complex it is. But we are machines too, someone said. The interpreter heard the comment to the response of the man and told him so. Smiling, the man said, "You're right. When I saw the light I acted like a machine with super sensitivity. Although I must tell you that when I see what that I see, and I also know that I do it. If you're machine also you can do it. Tell her I want to talk to her." The room erupted in laughter. The person who had raised the question was raised, and after honoring the man with a nod, he sat back down. The man ordered the lights to be turned off and began to sing in a deep, melancholic tone. He who thinks of sensible objects adheres to them. Clinging creates illusions. Illusions breed rage. Anger causes memory loss. Memory loss ends with reason. When reason disappears, reason comes destruction. When he finished, he fell silent, and then there was silence. Only silence.